Sometimes a man reaches a point where he'd pay any price for silence, even if it means buying a house soaked in blood. At 62, Luther Pike carried more regrets than the worn leather satchel that held his daughter's ashes, and all he wanted was a quiet place to fade away from the world that had taken everything from him. The old homestead in New Mexico seemed perfect, cheap, isolated, and avoided by locals who called it the Devil's Porch. For $100 cash, Luther bought what he thought would be his final refuge. The two-story cabin had sat empty for years, whispered to be cursed by cartel violence and smugglers' gold. But Luther wasn't afraid of ghosts. He should have been. Inside those crumbling walls lay secrets that would force him to confront his past in ways he never imagined. What was hidden in a cellar that refused to stay locked? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert wind carried the scent of sage, and something else, something that made Luther's weathered hands tighten on the reins as his horse picked its way down the rocky slope toward what would either be his salvation or his grave. The two-story adobe structure squatted against the crimson mesa like a wound that refused to heal, its walls the color of dried blood in the late afternoon sun. Wooden shutters hung at odd angles, some missing entirely, giving the windows the appearance of half-closed eyes, watching his approach with weary suspicion. Luther had seen plenty of abandoned places in his 40-odd years of trapping through the high country, but none that seemed to pulse with such palpable unease. The locals in Esperanza had crossed themselves when he'd mentioned his purchase, muttering warnings in rapid Spanish that his limited understanding couldn't fully grasp. Only old Miguel at the cantina had been willing to speak. Plainly, his rheumy eyes fixed on the amber liquid in his glass as he'd whispered, "La Casa del Diablo, Señor, the devil's own porch. Some debts follow a man beyond the grave." Now dismounting in what had once been a front yard, Luther could see why the place earned such a reputation. The ground around the house was barren except for scattered bones, animal bones, he assured himself, though their bleached whiteness against the red earth created patterns that seemed almost deliberate. A wooden cross, larger than seemed necessary for any normal household shrine, stood tilted at the property's edge, its arms reaching toward the house as if in perpetual blessing or warning. The leather satchel containing Sarah's ashes bumped against his hip as he approached the front door, a constant reminder of why he'd come to this forsaken place. 3 years had passed since the consumption had taken her, 3 years of carrying her remains from one failed attempt at peace to another. She deserved better than a father who'd spent her childhood chasing pelts through dangerous country, better than the man who'd been too proud to come home when she'd needed him most. Luther pulled the iron key from his vest pocket, the only thing the previous owner's representative had given him besides a deed that felt suspiciously light on details. The door's wood was solid despite its weathered appearance, but the key turned easily, as if the house were eager to welcome him inside. The hinges groaned a low note that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. The interior struck him immediately with its contradictions. Dust motes danced in shafts of dying sunlight that slanted through gaps in the shutters, yet the air held a freshness that suggested recent habitation. Furniture remained throughout the main room, a heavy wooden table, chairs that looked hand-carved, shelves lined with books whose spines bore Spanish titles he couldn't read. Personal belongings lay scattered as if their owners had simply stepped out for an evening walk. A woman's shawl draped over a chair back, children's wooden toys arranged in what might have been the middle of a game, a man's pipe resting in a clay ashtray beside an unfinished letter. Above the massive stone fireplace hung a hand-carved wooden cross, larger and more ornate than the one outside. Spanish words were burned into its surface in flowing script, and beneath them, someone had carved what appeared to be scratch marks, deliberate gouges that spoke of desperation or fear. Luther stepped closer, running his fingers along the marks. They were fresh enough to still show splinters, made perhaps within the last few years. Santa Maria, Madre de Dios, he read aloud, his pronunciation clumsy but recognizable. Holy Mary, Mother of God. The words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, and for a moment Luther could have sworn he heard an echo, not of his own voice, but of a woman's, soft and pleading. He shook his head and continued his exploration. The kitchen retained the smell of cornmeal and chili peppers, as if someone had been cooking recently. Cast-iron pots hung from hooks above a wood-burning stove that looked well-maintained despite the house's abandonment. On the counter, a wooden bowl held what appeared to be dried beans, though when Luther touched them, they crumbled to dust at his fingertips. The staircase to the second floor was solid under his boots, but each step produced a different note, creating an odd melody that reminded him of church bells. 3 bedrooms waited above a master room with a marriage bed covered in a hand-woven blanket, and 2 smaller rooms that had clearly belonged to children. In one, a child's dress hung from a peg on the wall, small enough for a girl of perhaps 8 or 9. In the other, wooden soldiers stood, arranged in formation on a windowsill, their painted uniforms faded, but still showing traces of blue and gold. It was in the master bedroom that Luther found the first real clue to the house's former inhabitants. A family photograph sat on the bedside table in a silver frame tarnished with age. The image showed a man with kind eyes and work-worn hands standing behind a woman whose beauty seemed to glow even through the sepia tones. 3 children surrounded them, 2 boys and a girl, all bearing their parents' warm smiles. On the back of the frame, someone had written in careful script, Familia Santos, 1881, the Santos family. Luther studied their faces, noting how the father's eyes held the same wariness he'd seen in his own reflection lately, the look of a man who'd seen too much of the world's cruelty. The mother's hands rested protectively on her children's shoulders, and something in her expression suggested she'd known their happiness was fragile, temporary. As evening approached, Luther made the practical preparations of a man accustomed to making do with what he found. He located a well behind, the house that still drew sweet water, discovered a root cellar stocked with preserved goods that hadn't yet spoiled, and found enough seasoned wood stacked against the back wall to keep a fire burning through several nights. The previous inhabitants had been thorough in their preparations, as if they'd expected to return. By candlelight, Luther unpacked his few belongings in the master bedroom, placing Sarah's ashes on the mantelpiece beside the photograph of the Santos family. The leather satchel looked small and insignificant next to the evidence of a complete family's life, but it represented his entire world now, the last physical connection to the daughter he'd failed. "I'm sorry, little bird," he whispered to the ashes, using the pet name he'd called her as a child. "I know this isn't what you would have wanted for me, hiding away like a wounded animal, but I don't know how else to carry this weight." The house seemed to listen to his words, and for a moment Luther felt less alone than he had in months. Perhaps it was the lingering warmth of a family's love that had once filled these rooms, or perhaps it was simply the relief of finally having walls around him instead of endless sky and the constant reminder of his failures. As he prepared for sleep, Luther noticed something odd about the bedroom's construction. The floorboards near the far wall didn't quite match the others. They were slightly newer, as if they'd been replaced recently. When he knelt to examine them more closely, he found that several boards were loose, held down by nothing more than habit and the weight of the furniture above them. But exhaustion weighed heavier than curiosity, and Luther decided his investigation could wait for daylight. He blew out the candle and settled into the marriage bed that still held the faint scent of lavender and sage, scents that reminded him of Sarah's hair when she was small and would crawl into his lap after a nightmare. Outside, the desert wind picked up, howling around the house's corners with a sound that was almost musical, almost like voices calling across vast distances. Luther closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him, the first peaceful noise he'd heard in years that didn't carry the weight of his regrets. For the first time since Sarah's death, Luther Pike slept without dreams of what might have been, cradled in a house that seemed to understand the particular nature of loss and the desperate hope for redemption that had brought him to its door. The wind continued its song through the night, and if it carried other voices, the whispered prayers of a mother, the laughter of children, the gentle murmur of a father telling bedtime stories, Luther was too deeply asleep to hear them. But somewhere in the depths of his rest, his lips curved into the ghost of a smile, as if some part of him recognized the sound of a family's love and found comfort in knowing that such things had once existed in this place, where he'd come to find his own peace. Dawn would bring discoveries that would change everything, but for now, Luther Pike was exactly where he needed to be, in a house that held secrets and sorrows as deep as his own, surrounded by the lingering presence of people who had understood that love and loss were two sides of the same precious coin. Luther woke to the sound of scratching. At first, he attributed it to mice or rats. Any abandoned house would have its share of vermin, but as consciousness fully returned, he realized the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, to be random scurrying. It came from directly beneath the floorboards, where he'd noticed the mismatched wood the night before, a steady scritch, scritch, scritch that seemed almost like writing. The morning sun streamed through gaps in the shutters, casting long rectangles of gold across the bedroom floor. Luther dressed quickly and retrieved his hunting knife from his pack, using the blade to pry at the loose boards he'd discovered. The wood came up easily, as if it had been removed and replaced many times before. Beneath the floorboards lay a hollow space lined with oiled cloth. Inside the makeshift hiding place, Luther found a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age, but remarkably well preserved. The cover bore no title, only initials burned into the leather. M.S. Maria Santos. Luther opened the journal carefully, mindful of the brittle pages. The writing was in Spanish, penned in a woman's careful hand. Though his understanding of the language was limited, he could make out dates, names, and enough words to piece together fragments of meaning. The earliest entries seemed routine notes about household matters, the children's health, her husband, Carlos's work, but as Luther flipped through the pages, the tone changed markedly. Los hombres oscuros appeared repeatedly in later entries, the dark men. Luther's Spanish was rough, learned from trading with Mexican trappers over the Sound. Years, but he could sense the growing fear in Maria's words. She wrote of men watching the house, of Carlos coming home late with worried expressions, of having to hide things esconder las cosas, though she never specified what. One entry, dated the 15th of October 1881, was written in shaking handwriting that betrayed Maria's terror. They came again today. Carlos says we have no choice. The children ask why Mama cries, but how can I tell them? How can I explain that evil men have made our home a prison? They want us to keep their filthy gold, to let them use our cellar for their devil's work. Carlos says if we refuse, they will kill us all. But if we agree, are we not already dead? Santa Maria, protect my babies. I fear what tomorrow will bring. Luther's blood chilled as he read. The journal painted a picture of a family caught in the web of dangerous men, forced to participate in activities that violated everything they believed. As he continued reading, more details emerged. Carlos Santos had been a simple farmer, trying to make an honest living from the harsh desert soil. But their property sat along a smuggling route used by men who dealt in stolen goods and worse. The Santos family had been given a choice that was no choice at all: cooperate or die. The most disturbing entries came near the end. Maria wrote of her daughter Elena, asking why strange men visited in the night, of her son Miguel, having nightmares about monsters in the cellar. She described how the men had forced Carlos to help them modify the house, creating hiding places and secret passages for their contraband. "They have turned our home into a place of sin," Maria wrote. "Every night I pray that God will forgive us for what we do to protect our children. But I fear our prayers fall on deaf ears. This place feels cursed now, poisoned by their presence. Even the walls seem to weep." Luther found himself drawn deeper into Maria's story, seeing uncomfortable parallels to his own life. She wrote extensively about her fears for her children's future, about the helplessness of watching danger close in around those you love most. In one particularly haunting passage, she described trying to maintain normalcy for her children while knowing that their world was crumbling. "Elena helped me bake bread today, her little hands covered in flour, laughing as she always does. How can such innocence exist in the same space as such evil? I watch my daughter and see Sarah, another child whose father failed to protect her from a world too cruel for young hearts." Luther stopped reading, his hands trembling. The last sentence made no sense. Maria Santos couldn't have known about Sarah. Yet there it was, written in the same careful hand as the rest of the journal. He read the passage again, but the words remained unchanged. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. The final entries grew increasingly frantic. Maria wrote of attempts to escape, of packing their belongings in secret, of Carlos making contact with someone who might help them disappear. But her last coherent entry, dated the 2nd of November 1881, was filled with despair. "They know. Carlos came home tonight with blood on his shirt and terror in his eyes. They know we plan to run. The dark men are coming tomorrow, and this time they will not let us live. I am hiding this journal in the place Carlos made for me, hoping that someday someone will find it and know what happened to the Santos family. If you are reading this, please remember us. Please remember that we were good people who tried to do right by our children. And please, if you have children of your own, hold them close. Do not let the world take them as it has taken ours." The page ended there, but something more had been written, a single line in different ink, as if added later. "He is coming, the one who will understand our pain and set things right." Luther's hands shook as he closed the toned journal. The final line made his skin crawl with its seeming prophecy. How could Maria Santos have known that a man carrying his own burden of parental failure would find her words decades later? Rising from the floor, Luther walked to the window and opened the shutters fully. The bright desert morning did little to dispel the darkness that had settled over his thoughts. The Santos family had been trapped by circumstances beyond their control, forced to choose between their principles and their children's lives. In the end, it seemed they had chosen to resist and paid the ultimate price. But what had happened to their bodies? The house showed no signs of violence, no bloodstains or damage from a struggle. If the family had been murdered here, where were they buried? And what had become of the dark men who had destroyed their lives? Luther descended to the main floor and began a more thorough search of the house. In the kitchen, he found scratch marks similar to those on the wooden cross, desperate gouges in the doorframe that suggested someone had tried to claw their way out. The cellar door, which he hadn't yet explored, bore a heavy iron bar across it, as if to keep something locked inside rather than to keep intruders out. The bar lifted easily, but the cellar door itself seemed heavier than it should be. Luther lit a candle and descended the stone steps into darkness. The cellar was larger than he'd expected, extending beyond the house's foundation. Most of it appeared to be natural cave formation, rough stone walls that disappeared into shadow beyond his candle's reach. But what caught his attention immediately was the newer stonework along one wall. Someone had bricked up a section of the cellar, and the mortar looked fresh compared to the rest of the foundation. The work was crude, done hastily by unskilled hands. Tools lay scattered nearby: a trowel, a bucket that still held dried mortar, and a pickaxe that looked as if it had been thrown. Down in haste, Luther approached the sealed wall cautiously. The bricks were loose in places, and when he pressed against them, he could feel them shift. Behind the wall, air moved with a slight breeze, suggesting another chamber or tunnel system. But there was something else, a smell that made his stomach turn, sweet and cloying even after all these years. As he examined the wall more closely, Luther noticed something that made his blood freeze. Scratched into the mortar between the bricks were words in Spanish, carved with desperate fingers. "Perdónanos, Dios mío," forgive us, my God. The candlelight flickered, and for a moment Luther could have sworn he saw other figures in the cellar shadows that moved independently of his candle's flame. A woman in a long dress stood near the sealed wall, her hands pressed against the bricks. 3 smaller shadows clustered around her, and all of them seemed to be looking directly at him. Luther blinked hard, and the shadows were gone. But the feeling of being watched remained, along with the certain knowledge that the Santos family's story was far from over. Whatever lay behind that hastily built wall, it held the key to understanding what had happened in this house, and perhaps why he had been drawn here. The journal had been just the beginning. Now Luther faced a choice that echoed the one Carlos Santos had confronted decades earlier. Walk away and preserve his peace, or dig deeper into secrets that might destroy him. He thought of Sarah, of the regrets that had driven him to this forsaken place, and knew he had no choice at all. The Santos family deserved justice, and perhaps in seeking it for them, he might find some small measure of redemption for himself. The cellar wall would have to be opened, no matter what horrors it might reveal. Luther spent the better part of the morning gathering tools from around the property. The Santos family had been well-prepared people. He found a sledgehammer in the barn, chisels in a wooden toolbox, and even a crowbar that looked like it had seen recent use. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was using Carlos Santos's own tools to uncover what had likely been the man's final desperate act. The first swing of the sledgehammer against the cellar wall sent vibrations through the stone floor and up into Luther's bones. The impact echoed strangely in the confined space, as if the sound bounced through chambers he couldn't see. Mortar crumbled away in chunks, and the newer bricks proved easier to dislodge than he'd expected. Someone had built this wall quickly, without the skill or time to make it permanent. After an hour of steady work, Luther had opened a gap large enough to peer through. He held his candle to the opening and found himself looking into a natural cave chamber that extended beyond his light's reach. The smell that emerged was stronger, now not just decay, but something else. Something that reminded him of the desert after a flash, flood, all earth and water, and things long buried. But it was what lay just inside the opening that stopped Luther's breath entirely. A child's wooden doll, faded and worn, missing one arm, sat propped against the cave wall as if someone had placed it there carefully. The doll's painted face had mostly worn away, but enough remained to see that it had once been beautiful, crafted with love and attention to detail. Luther squeezed through the gap he'd created and picked up the doll with trembling hands. It was smaller than he'd expected, sized for a very young child, perhaps Elena Santos, the little girl from the family photograph. The missing arm had been torn away roughly, and the fabric of its dress was stained with something dark that could have been blood or just the accumulated grime of decades. Holding the doll brought back a flood of memories Luther had spent years trying to suppress. Sarah, at age 4, clutching a similar doll during a thunderstorm, crying because Luther had to leave for another long trapping expedition. Sarah, at 6, carefully mending her doll's dress with clumsy stitches, telling him it was hurt and needed Papa's medicine. Sarah, at 8, too old for dolls, but keeping this one hidden under her bed because it reminded her of when he used to read her stories. "I bought you a doll like this once," Luther whispered to the darkness. "Remember, little bird? That Christmas when you were 5 and you hugged it so tight I thought you might squeeze the stuffing out of it." The memory was crystal clear despite his efforts to bury it. Sarah had been sick that winter, running fevers that left her weak and pale. Luther had ridden 2 days through a blizzard to find a town with a proper store. spending most of his winter's earnings on a doll with real hair and a dress made of blue silk. When he'd given it to her, Sarah had looked up at him with eyes bright with fever and joy and whispered, "Now, I won't be lonely when you're gone, Papa." He'd left 3 days later for a trapping run that kept him away until spring. By the time he returned, Sarah had outgrown dolls, and the blue-dressed treasure sat forgotten on a shelf. He'd never seen such pure happiness in her eyes again. Luther set the doll down carefully and continued exploring the cave. The chamber was roughly circular, about 20 feet across, with several passages leading deeper into the earth. Someone had been using this space. He found the remains of wooden crates, coils of rope, and metal tools that had long since rusted. This had been a storage area, hidden from the house above and accessible through the cellar. But it was more than a storage area. Along one wall, Luther discovered crude sleeping spaces carved into the rock, lined with moth-eaten blankets and straw mattresses. People had lived down here, hidden from the world above. The arrangement spoke of fear, of people who needed to disappear quickly and completely. As Luther explored further, he found evidence of the Santos family's final days. Children's clothes lay folded in neat stacks, as if Maria had been preparing for a journey. A man's boots sat beside a leather satchel that contained papers too faded to read. Most heartbreaking of all was a small shrine someone had created in an alcove, a wooden cross surrounded by melted candle stubs, with 3 smooth stones arranged beneath it. On each stone, a name had been scratched: Elena, Miguel, Joaquin, the Santos children. Their parents had created a memorial for them here in this dark place, perhaps knowing they would never see proper graves or have their names spoken in church. Luther knelt before the shrine and felt the weight of another family's grief pressing down on him like a physical force. "They were just babies," he said aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the cavern. "Elena couldn't have been more than 8. How does a man protect children from monsters when the monsters have all the power?" The question hung in the air, and Luther realized he was no longer thinking only about the Santos family. His own failures pressed against his chest like a physical weight. Sarah had died alone in a charity hospital while he was 3 states away, chasing rumors of a silver strike that had turned out to be worthless. She'd sent letters he'd never received, asking him to come home, telling him she was scared. By the time he'd learned of her illness, she'd been dead for 2 weeks. "I should have been there," Luther whispered to the shrine. "I should have been there for her, just like Carlos should have been able to protect his children. But we failed, didn't we? We failed because the world is full of dark men, and sometimes good people can't fight them all." A sound echoed through the cavern's soft footsteps that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Luther spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at his hip, but he saw nothing except shadows dancing in his candlelight. The footsteps continued, circling him like children playing a game, and with them came whispers too faint to understand, but somehow familiar. "Elena?" Luther called softly. "Miguel? Joaquin?" The whispers stopped abruptly, but the presence remained. Luther could feel eyes watching him from the darkness, not malevolent but curious, as if the children were trying to decide whether this strange man could be trusted. He thought of the final entry in Maria's journal, the mysterious line about someone coming who would understand their pain. "I know what it's like," Luther said to the darkness. "I know what it's like to lose everything, to fail the people who needed you most. If you're here, if you can somehow hear me, I want you to know that I understand." The silence stretched on, but it felt different now, expectant rather than empty. Luther carefully picked up Elena's doll and cradled it against his chest, as he'd once held Sarah during her nightmares. "I'm going to find out what happened to you," he promised. "I'm going to find out who hurt your family, and I'm going to make sure people remember that the Santos family were good people who deserved better than this world gave them." As he spoke, the candle flame flickered and danced, casting strange shadows on the cave walls. For just a moment, Luther could have sworn he saw them, three small figures, standing just at the edge of his light, watching him with eyes that held both sorrow and hope. When the flames steadied, they were gone, but Luther felt something had changed. The cave no longer felt like a tomb, but like a sacred space where the dead waited patiently for justice to find its way to them at last. The ride into Esperanza took Luther 3 hours across desert terrain that seemed determined to discourage visitors. The town squatted in a valley between red mesas like a collection of bleached bones, its adobe buildings the same color as the surrounding earth. A few hardy souls moved between the shadows of buildings, but most sensible people stayed indoors during the heat of midday. Luther had come seeking answers, but more than that, he'd come because he couldn't shake the feeling that someone needed to know the Santos family had existed, had mattered, had been more than just another casualty of frontier violence. The doll rested in his saddlebag, wrapped carefully in one of his clean shirts. He wasn't sure why he'd brought it, but leaving it in that dark cave had felt like abandoning Elena all over again. The Territorial Records Office occupied half of a building that also housed the postal service and what passed for a telegraph station. A woman with graying hair and suspicious eyes looked up from her ledger when Luther entered, her gaze taking in his worn clothes and weathered face with the practiced assessment of someone who'd learned to judge trouble before it announced itself. "Need something recorded?" she asked in English, tinged with a slight Spanish accent. "Looking for information about a family named Santos," Luther replied, removing his hat. Carlos and Maria Santos lived out on what they call the Devil's Porch, had 3 children. The woman's expression shifted subtly, wariness replacing mere suspicion. "Santos family's been gone for years now. Why are you asking about them?" "I bought their property, found some of their belongings, thought maybe they had relatives who'd want them back." She studied him for a long moment, then rose and walked to a wall of filing cabinets. "Santos," she murmured, running her finger along the alphabetized tabs. "Here we are." The file she pulled was thicker than Luther had expected. She spread the papers across the counter between them, pointing to various documents with a finger that bore a simple gold wedding band. "Carlos Santos bought that land in 1878, she explained. "Paid cash, same as you did. Good people, the Santos family. Maria used to bring the children to town for church every Sunday. Elena was just a little thing, always carrying that wooden doll her father made for her." Luther's chest tightened. "You knew them personally?" "Knew them well, as anyone did. My husband and Carlos sometimes worked together during harvest season. Said Carlos was the hardest working man he'd ever met, never asked for more than a fair wage." Her expression darkened. "Then things changed." "Changed how?" The woman glanced around the empty office before leaning closer. "Men started coming around, asking questions about the Santos family. Strangers with too much money and not enough patience. Carlos stopped coming to town except when he had to, and when he did, he looked like a man carrying the weight of the world." Luther felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of men?" "The kind that don't give their real names. Americans mostly, but some Mexicans too. They'd ask about the family's comings and goings, about who visited them, about whether Carlos had any debts." She shook her head. "Then one day, the Santos family just disappeared. House sat empty until you bought it. No one investigated? No law enforcement?" The woman's laugh held no humor. "Mister, out here the law is whoever has the most guns and the least conscience. The territorial marshal might ride through twice a year if we're lucky. By the time anyone with authority came around, it was just another abandoned homestead in a land full of them." Luther studied the papers spread before him. Property deeds, tax records, a few receipts from local merchants. But one document caught his attention, a promissory note dated September 1881, just 2 months before Maria's final journal entry. "This debt," Luther said, pointing to the note. "Carlos owed money to someone called Western Territory Holdings." "You know anything about them?" The woman's face went pale. Don't know nothing about that, and don't want to. Some questions are better left unasked around here. But Luther could see knowledge in her eyes and fear. Ma'am, I found some of their belongings in the house, personal things that suggest they didn't leave willingly. If something happened to that family, their children deserve to be remembered. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming nervously on the counter. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Western Territory Holdings wasn't a real company. It was a name some men used when they wanted to make their business look legal. They'd loan money to families who were struggling, then when the debts came due, they'd demand payment in services instead of cash. What kind of services? The kind that involved moving things across the border without involving customs officials. Carlos Santos was an honest man who got caught in a web he couldn't escape from. She gathered up the papers quickly. That's all I know, and it's more than I should have told you. Luther reached into his saddlebag and carefully unwrapped Elena's doll. The woman gasped when she saw it, her hand flying to her throat. Dios mío, she whispered. That's Elena's doll. Carlos made it for her 3rd birthday. She carried it everywhere. Her eyes filled with tears. Where did you find it? Hidden in the house, along with other things that suggest the family didn't just move away. Luther rewrapped the doll carefully. This little girl and her brothers deserve better than being forgotten. Someone needs to know they existed, that they mattered. The woman wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Elena Santos would be a grown woman now if she'd lived. Beautiful child, smart as a whip. Used to help her mother with the younger boys, always so careful with them. She looked at the wrapped doll. What are you planning to do? I'm going to find out what happened to them. And if someone hurt them, I'm going to make sure they answer for it. That's dangerous talk, senor. The men who destroyed the Santos family might still be around. They won't appreciate someone asking questions. Luther thought of Sarah, of all the questions he'd never asked, all the protection he'd never provided. Sometimes a man reaches a point where he's got nothing left to lose and everything to make right. I think I've reached that point. The woman studied his face for a long moment, then reached under the counter and pulled out a small leather pouch. Carlos gave this to my husband for safekeeping just before they disappeared. Said if anything happened to his family, it should go to someone who would understand what it meant. Inside the pouch was a silver locket, tarnished with age. Luther opened it carefully and found himself looking at a family photograph, the same faces he'd seen in the bedroom, but younger, happier. On the back of the locket, someone had engraved a simple message, Para mis hijos con amor eterno, for my children with eternal love. Carlos knew something was going to happen, the woman said quietly. He wanted to make sure his children would be remembered, no matter what. Luther closed the locket and slipped it into his vest pocket, feeling the weight of another family's love settling against his heart. The Santos family had been just like him, ordinary people trying to protect what they loved most in a world that seemed determined to take it away. But unlike him, they'd never had the chance to make things right. The discovery came 3 days later, while Luther was searching through Maria's belongings with the methodical patience of a man who had spent decades tracking elusive prey through wilderness. He had been examining her dresses, looking for more hidden pockets or secret compartments, when his fingers detected something unusual in the lining of her Sunday dress, the blue one she would have worn to church, to present her family as respectable and God-fearing to the community. The seam had been carefully opened and resewn, the stitching so neat that only someone looking for such modifications would notice. Inside the lining, folded into a space no larger than his palm, Luther found a piece of oiled cloth protecting what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. The map was remarkably detailed, despite its small size. Maria had drawn it with the precision of someone whose life might depend on its accuracy. It showed the house and surrounding terrain, but also revealed features. Luther hadn't yet discovered a network of natural caves and man-made tunnels that connected the property to locations miles away. Dotted lines marked what appeared to be routes through the desert, with Spanish notations indicating distances and landmarks. But it was the X marked in red ink that made Luther's hands tremble as he studied the map. The mark sat at the confluence of 3 tunnel systems, in a location Maria had labeled El Tesoro del Diablo, the Devil's Treasure. Below the mark, in her careful handwriting, she had written a single word: Sangre, blood. Luther spread the map on the kitchen table and weighted its corners with stones. By candlelight, he traced the routes with his finger, trying to understand the full scope of what the Santos family had been forced to become part of. The tunnel system was extensive, clearly the work of years, connecting the house to what appeared to be natural caves throughout the surrounding mesas. Someone had invested enormous time and effort into creating a hidden highway through the desert, invisible to casual observation, but capable of moving large quantities of goods without detection. The implications were staggering. This wasn't the work of simple bandits or small-time smugglers. The level of organization, the engineering required to map and excavate these tunnels, spoke of an operation with significant resources and long-term planning. The Santos family hadn't just been victims of random violence, they had been caught in the machinery of something much larger and more dangerous. Luther gathered his tools and returned to the cellar, this time armed with Maria's map and a better understanding of what he was looking for. The cave system he'd partially explored was just one branch of a much larger network. According to the map, the main tunnel should be accessible through a section of the cellar he hadn't yet examined thoroughly. It took him an hour of careful searching to find the entrance, a section of wall that appeared solid but proved to be a cleverly disguised door. The mechanism was simple but effective. A stone that looked like part of the foundation could be rotated to release a counterweight system that swung open a narrow passage. Luther lit 2 candles and squeezed through the opening into a tunnel that had been carved with professional skill. The walls were smooth, the ceiling reinforced with wooden timbers, and the floor worn smooth by years of foot traffic. This wasn't the crude excavation of desperate people. This was infrastructure, built to last and built to conceal. Following Maria's map, Luther made his way through a maze of interconnected passages. Some were natural cave formations, others clearly man-made. He passed storage chambers stocked with empty crates and barrels, sleeping areas with moldering blankets, and even what appeared to be an underground stable area, complete with feeding troughs and water barrels. The scale of the operation became clearer with each chamber he explored. This had been a sophisticated smuggling network, capable of moving large quantities of goods and substantial numbers of people without detection. The tunnels connected to multiple surface entrances hidden throughout the desert, creating an invisible highway that bypassed all official border crossings and territorial law enforcement. But it was when Luther reached the chamber marked on Maria's map as El Tesoro del Diablo that he truly understood the horror the Santos family had been forced to live with. The chamber was larger than the others, its walls lined with wooden shelves and metal strongboxes. But the treasure here wasn't gold or silver or even stolen goods. The shelves held human remains, dozens of skulls arranged in neat rows, along with collections of personal belongings that told the stories of lives cut short. Wedding rings, lockets containing family photographs, children's toys, religious medals, the accumulated possessions of people who had died far from home and been reduced to anonymous bones. In the center of the chamber sat a wooden table that had been stained dark with old blood. Restraints made of rope and iron were still attached to its edges, and the surface bore the marks of blades and other tools Luther didn't want to identify. This had been a place of torture and murder, where victims had been brought to be questioned, broken, and killed. Luther's stomach turned as the full implications hit him. The Santos family hadn't just been forced to hide smuggled goods. They had been made unwilling accomplices to mass murder. Their house had been the surface entrance to a killing ground, their cellar the gateway to a chamber where countless people had died in agony. On one of the shelves, Luther found something that made his blood freeze. A small wooden cross, carved in the same style as the one hanging above the Santos fireplace, but this one bore a name: Padre Miguel Herrera, 1881. The missing priest, the woman in town, had mentioned the one who had tried to help families escape the smuggling network. Beside the cross lay the priest's rosary beads, their silver worn smooth by decades of faithful prayer. But they were broken now, scattered across the shelf as if torn away during a struggle. Luther gathered them carefully, feeling the weight of another good person's failed attempt to stand against evil. As he explored further, Luther found evidence that the killing chamber had been used recently. Some of the bloodstains on the table looked fresh compared to others, and several of the storage areas contained goods that couldn't be more than a few years old. The network might be dormant now, but it hadn't been completely abandoned. Standing in that chamber of horrors, surrounded by the evidence of so much death and suffering, Luther finally understood why he had been drawn to this place. Maria's final journal entry about someone coming who would understand their pain, it hadn't been prophecy. It had been hope. The hope that someday someone would find this place and bear witness to what had happened here. The Santos family had been forced to live above a mass grave, to sleep knowing that beneath their feet lay the bones of dozens of murdered innocents. They had tried to escape, tried to find help, tried to protect their children from knowledge of what their home had become. And when they had finally attempted to break free, they had been silenced forever. But their silence was ending now. Luther Pike had found their secret, and he would make sure the world knew what had happened in the chamber beneath the Devil's Porch. Luther emerged from the tunnels as the sun reached its zenith, his clothes stained with cave dust and his mind reeling from what he'd discovered. But as he climbed out of the cellar, he found he was no longer alone on the property. A horse stood tethered near his own mount, and smoke rose from the chimney of the house he'd left cold that morning. Moving carefully, Luther approached the house with the practiced stealth of a man who'd spent decades hunting game that could hear a footstep from 50 yards away. Through the kitchen window, he could see a figure seated at the table, an elderly Mexican man in the simple black clothing of a priest, calmly drinking coffee from one of Maria's cups, as if he had every right to be there. Luther entered through the front door, his hand resting on his pistol but not drawing it. The priest looked up with eyes that held depths of sadness Luther recognized in his own mirror. "You must be Luther Pike," the priest said in accented English, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I am Father Francisco Morales. I have been waiting for you to finish your exploration below. How did you know I was down there? How do you know my name? The same way I knew you would come to this place eventually. The same way I knew you would be the one to finally uncover what happened to the Santos family." The priest sipped his coffee slowly. "Some stories call to the people who need to hear them most." Luther remained standing, studying this unexpected visitor. The priest was perhaps 70, with silver hair and hands marked by decades of manual labor. But his eyes held the particular weariness of someone who had seen too much of human cruelty and never learned to accept it. "You knew the Santos family," Luther said. "It wasn't a question. I married Carlos and Maria. I baptized their children. I watched them try to build a good life in a place that had been cursed long before they arrived." Father Morales set down his cup carefully, "And I failed to save them when they needed me most. The rosary beads in the tunnel. They belonged to Father Miguel Herrera, my predecessor. Miguel tried to help families escape the men who controlled this network. He organized safe passages, hid people in the church, even tried to contact territorial authorities." The priest's voice grew heavy. "They tortured him to death in that chamber you found, trying to learn the names of other families he'd helped." Luther finally sat down, the weight of another man's guilt, recognizing its reflection. "You've known about the tunnels all along." "I've known, but I've been powerless to act. The men who created that place, they're not just criminals, Mr. Pike. Some of them wear badges, some of them sit in territorial offices, some of them give orders to the very soldiers who are supposed to protect innocent people. The priest reached into his cassock and withdrew something, wrapped in black cloth. Miguel left this with me before he made his final attempt to help the Santos family. He said if he didn't return, I should give it to someone who could use it to seek justice. Inside, the cloth was a leather portfolio containing documents that made Luther's blood run cold. Military correspondence, territorial records, financial agreements, all bearing official seals and signatures he recognized from his own time in service. The papers detailed a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple smuggling. Operation Desert Shield. Luther read aloud from one document. Joint Territorial Federal Initiative to secure border regions through enhanced cooperation with local enforcement assets. Enhanced cooperation, Father Morales said bitterly. A beautiful phrase for selling protection to smugglers and murderers in exchange for information about Mexican revolutionary activities. Luther studied the documents more carefully, his military experience helping him decode the bureaucratic language. The operation had been designed to create a network of informants and safe houses along the border, ostensibly to gather intelligence about Mexican political movements that might threaten American interests. But the reality had been far darker. They turned the whole region into a hunting ground, Luther said, understanding beginning to dawn. Official protection for criminals in exchange for intelligence that probably never materialized. The Santos family was trapped when Carlos refused to let them use his property for the killing chamber. They offered him money, then threatened him, then finally gave him a choice: cooperate or watch his children die slowly. Luther found his own name in one of the documents, a list of military personnel who had participated in border operations during the late 1872. His stomach turned as he realized the implications. I was part of this. The missions we ran along the border, the intelligence we gathered about Mexican families who might be sympathetic to revolutionary causes. You provided the initial target lists, Father Morales confirmed gently. Families who were considered security risks, people who needed to be watched or eliminated. You didn't know what would happen to that information, but you gathered it faithfully. The revelation hit Luther like a physical blow. His military service, which he'd always seen as honorable despite its difficulties, had been the foundation for the network that eventually destroyed the Santos family. His reports about Mexican families along the border had marked them for death or forced cooperation with the smuggling operation. Sarah knew, Luther whispered, understanding flooding through him. She was researching my military records when she died. She'd found the connection. Father Morales nodded sadly. Your daughter had been corresponding with several families affected by Operation Desert Shield. She was trying to document what had happened to help them seek justice. The Santos family was just one of many she'd identified. Luther's hands shook as he held the documents that connected his past to the horrors beneath this house. Sarah had died trying to atone for his sins, attempting to help the people his military service had unknowingly doomed. She'd carried the weight of his actions without ever telling him, trying to fix what he had broken. The men who ran this operation, Luther said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. They're still alive, some of them. They've moved on to other positions, other schemes. But they remember this place, and they remember. If word gets out about what you've discovered, they'll come to silence me, just like they silenced the Santos family. Father Morales reached across the table and placed his weathered hand over Luther's. Your daughter believed that truth could overcome even the deepest evil, Mr. Pike. She died believing that someone would eventually finish what she started. Luther thought of Sarah's ashes sitting on the mantelpiece above them, of her letters he'd never received, of the justice she'd tried to secure for families she'd never met. His failure to protect her had led to her death, but her work had led him here, to this moment of terrible understanding. The rosary beads, Luther said suddenly. Miguel's rosary. It's not just a religious artifact, is it? Father Morales smiled sadly. Miguel was a careful man. Each bead contains a rolled paper with names, dates, locations. Everything he learned about the operation before they killed him. Everything your daughter needed to prove what really happened here. Luther understood now why he'd been drawn to this cursed place, why Maria's journal had seemed to speak directly to his guilt. He'd come seeking peace, but he'd found a reckoning instead. The Santos family's tragedy was connected to his own actions, and their salvation would require him to confront the men whose orders he'd once followed without question. The devil's treasure wasn't gold or silver, it was truth, buried beneath decades of lies and protected by the spirits of those who died for it. Father Morales left at sunset, but not before pressing something into Luther's hand, a small brass key that felt warm despite the cooling evening air. "There's one more thing you need to see," the priest had said. "Something Miguel hid in your belongings before you bought this place. He was a man who believed in providence, in the idea that the right person would eventually come to claim what he'd preserved." Now, alone in the house as darkness settled over the desert, Luther examined his own possessions with new eyes. He'd traveled light to this place, carrying little more than clothes, tools, and Sarah's ashes. But as he searched through his leather saddlebags by candlelight, his fingers found something that made his heart stop. Sewn into the lining of his oldest saddlebag, the one he'd carried through his final years of military service, was a pocket he'd never noticed before. The stitching was so fine, so perfectly matched to the original construction, that it appeared to be part of the bag's original design. But when Luther worked the brass key into a tiny lock hidden beneath a leather flap, the pocket opened to reveal documents that would change everything he thought he knew about his own life. The papers were in his own handwriting, but he had no memory of creating them. Military reports, detailed intelligence assessments, personal letters, all bearing his signature and written in the careful script he'd developed during his years of service. But the content was horrifying. The first document was a letter addressed to his commanding officer, dated October 1879. "Colonel Morrison, the Santos family presents an ongoing security risk to our border operations. Carlos Santos has been observed in conversation with known Mexican revolutionary sympathizers, and his property's location makes it ideal for surveillance of our activities. Recommend immediate classification as hostile asset and implementation of standard conversion protocols." Luther's hands trembled as he read his own words, condemning the Santos family to their fate. But he had no memory of writing this report, no recollection of even knowing the Santos family existed before buying their property. The second document was worse, a detailed map of the Santos property, annotated in his handwriting, with notes about the family's daily routines, the children's play areas, the times when Carlos would be away from the house. It was the kind of intelligence-gathering report a soldier would compile before a military action, thorough and cold in its assessment of targets. But it was the third document that shattered Luther's understanding of his own past completely. It was a letter in his handwriting, but addressed to him. "Luther, if you are reading this, the process has been successful. You will have no memory of your final assignment or the events that led to your discharge. Dr. Wendell's experimental treatments have proven effective in removing traumatic memories while preserving core personality and skills. You served your country with honor even in those final months when duty required actions that would have destroyed a lesser man's sanity. The Santos family was terminated as ordered. The operation was clean, professional, and necessary for border security. You carried out your final mission with the same dedication you'd shown throughout your service, but the psychological cost was deemed too severe for you to carry. Better that you remember your service with pride than live with the weight of necessary but unpleasant truths. Your daughter Sarah's death was an unfortunate complication. She had begun investigating Operation Desert Shield, and her questions were attracting unwanted attention. Her illness was accelerated to prevent her from exposing classified operations. You were not present because you were completing your final assignment. Her sacrifice, like yours, served the greater good. You will be drawn back to the Santos property eventually. Dr. Wendell's treatments include subtle psychological conditioning that will ensure your return when circumstances require it. When that time comes, you will have the skills and motivation necessary to eliminate any evidence of Operation Desert Shield that might surface. Consider this letter your final briefing. Colonel James Morrison, Military Intelligence Division. Luther read the letter 3 times before its full implications sank in. His memory of his final military assignment was gone, erased by experimental medical procedures that had been performed without his knowledge or consent. He hadn't failed to protect Sarah from illness. She had been murdered because her investigation threatened military secrets. And he hadn't bought the Santos property seeking peace. He'd been psychologically conditioned to return here as a cleanup operation. The leather satchel containing Sarah's ashes sat on the mantelpiece above him, but now Luther understood it wasn't just a memento of his failure as a father. It was evidence of his success as a soldier. He had been present for her death, after all, had been the instrument of her murder, and his conscious mind had been wiped clean to preserve his sanity and the military's secrets. Father Morales had known. The priest's carefully chosen words, his arrival at precisely the right moment, his knowledge of Luther's name and purpose, it had all been orchestrated. But by whom? The military officers who wanted their secrets buried, or someone else who wanted those secrets exposed? Luther staggered to his feet, his legs weak with the shock of revelation. Everything he'd believed about himself, about his past, about his guilt over Sarah's death, had been a carefully constructed lie. He was not a failed father seeking redemption. He was a programmed killer who had murdered the Santos family and his own daughter, then had his memory wiped to preserve his effectiveness as an asset. But if his memory had been erased, how was he remembering now? Dr. Wendell's treatments were supposed to be permanent, irreversible, unless... Luther returned to the hidden pocket and found one final document, a medical file with his name on it. The treatments had not been entirely successful. Dr. Wendell had noted that strong emotional triggers could cause partial memory recovery, especially if the subject was exposed to physical evidence of suppressed events. The doctor had recommended periodic memory reinforcement treatments to prevent such recovery. The last entry in the medical file was dated just 6 months ago. Subject Pike has missed his scheduled maintenance treatment. Recommend immediate retrieval if exposure to trigger materials is suspected. They knew he was here. They knew his memory was returning. And they were coming to either recondition him or eliminate him permanently. But someone else had known too. Someone had placed these documents in his saddlebag, had ensured that Father Morales would arrive at the right moment, had guided Luther to the evidence that would restore his memory. The brass key hadn't come from Father Miguel, it had come from someone who wanted Luther to remember what he'd done, Sarah. The journal entries that had seemed too prescient, Maria's final words about someone coming who would understand their pain, it hadn't been prophecy or coincidence. Sarah had survived her poisoning somehow, had discovered the truth about her father's conditioning, and had spent years preparing for his inevitable return to this place. She was still alive, and she was here, in this house, waiting for him to remember who he really was, so she could finally confront the man who had killed her adoptive family and tried to kill her. Luther's hand moved instinctively to his pistol as he heard footsteps on the stairs above him. Slow, deliberate steps that belonged to someone who had every right to be in this house, who had been waiting patiently for this moment of revelation. "Hello, Papa." Sarah's voice drifted down from the second floor, older now, but unmistakably his daughter's. "I've been waiting for you to come home." The man who had bought the Santos property, seeking peace, no longer existed. In his place stood Captain Luther Pike, military assassin, the killer of the Santos family and the attempted murderer of his own daughter. And somewhere in this house was the woman who had spent years planning his reckoning. The daughter who had survived his betrayal and returned to claim justice for all his victims. The Devil's Porch was about to become the site of one final, long overdue confrontation between a father and daughter, between a killer and his greatest failure, between a man who had forgotten his sins and the woman who remembered them all. Luther's hand froze halfway to his weapon as Sarah's footsteps continued down the stairs, each step measured and deliberate like a countdown to judgment. When she appeared in the candlelight, Luther's breath caught in his throat. She was 30 now, no longer the pale, sickly girl he remembered, but a woman hardened by years of preparation and purpose. Her dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and her eyes held the same cold intelligence he'd once seen in his military superiors, the look of someone who had learned to plan death with surgical precision. "You look surprised to see me, Papa," Sarah said, settling into the chair Father Morales had occupied earlier. She moved with the fluid grace of someone trained in violence, and Luther noticed the way she kept her hands visible but ready. "Though I suppose Dr. Wendell told you I was dead. He was very convincing when he administered the poison, very professional in his explanation of why your daughter had to die for the greater good." Luther found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Sarah, how did you survive?" "Father Miguel." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He'd been watching the operation, documenting the murders. When they brought me to the killing chamber below, he was already hidden in the tunnels. The poison doctor Wendell used was designed to simulate death convincingly, slow the heart, suppress breathing, create the appearance of consumption's final stage. Miguel had seen it used before and knew the antidote. She reached into her coat and withdrew a leather journal, not Maria's, but one that looked newer, filled with precise handwriting and detailed sketches. "I spent 3 days dead, Papa. 3 days in that chamber surrounded by the bones of all your other victims, while Miguel nursed me back to health and told me exactly who my loving father really was." Luther sank into the chair across from her, the weight of recovered memories mixing with fresh horror. "I don't remember. I don't remember any of it. But you're starting to, aren't you, Doctor?" Wendell warned that strong emotional triggers could cause breakthrough episodes. "That's why they wanted you to return here for periodic reconditioning." Sarah opened her journal and showed him pages covered with photographs, documents, and detailed notes. "I've spent 15 years preparing for this conversation, gathering evidence, learning everything I could about Operation Desert Shield and your role in it." The journal was a masterpiece of investigation, containing details about dozens of families destroyed by the operation. Luther saw his own handwriting throughout intelligence reports, assassination orders, efficiency evaluations of different killing methods. Each page was a testament to his thoroughness as a military asset and his complete lack of conscience in following orders. "The Santos family wasn't your first assignment," Sarah continued, turning pages to show evidence of earlier murders. "You'd been eliminating security risks along the border for 3 years before you came here. Always families, always people who posed no real threat to anyone. You were very good at making it look like accidents or natural causes." Luther studied a photograph of a Mexican family, parents and 4 children, posed for what had probably been their only professional portrait. His own handwriting in the margin noted their elimination date and method: contaminated well water, symptoms consistent with natural disease outbreak. "Why?" Luther asked, though he wasn't sure if he was asking Sarah or himself. "Why would I do this?" "Because you believed in the mission. Because your commanding officers convinced you that these people were threats to American security. Because you were a soldier who followed orders without question." Sarah's voice carried a bitter edge. "And because you were very, very good at killing people who trusted you." She turned to a section of the journal filled with personal photographs, images of Luther with the families he'd murdered, always in the weeks or months before their deaths. The Santos family Christmas celebration, with Luther helping Carlos carry in firewood. A birthday party for little Elena, with Luther carving wooden toys for the children. A church service where Luther stood with the family during prayers. You infiltrated their lives, Sarah explained, made them trust you, become dependent on you. The Santos family thought you were helping Carlos find work, protecting them from the dangerous men who'd been threatening them, right up until the night you poisoned their dinner and buried them in the desert. Luther stared at a photograph of himself, helping Maria prepare a meal, both of them smiling warmly at the camera. He had no memory of the moment, but his face showed genuine affection for the woman he would later murder. How could I have done this and not remembered? Dr. Wendell's treatments were revolutionary. He could selectively erase traumatic memories while preserving skills and personality traits. You remained an effective soldier, but without the psychological burden of your actions. Sarah closed the journal carefully. The military considered it a perfect solution, disposable assassins who couldn't betray secrets they didn't remember possessing. But you survived, and you remember everything. I remember watching you murder the Santos children. I remember you looking me in the eyes, while Dr. Wendell injected the poison. I remember you telling me it was necessary for national security. Sarah's voice remained steady, but Luther could see the pain beneath her controlled exterior. Most of all, I remember realizing that the father I'd loved and trusted was a monster who had been using me to get close to his targets. The truth hit Luther like a physical blow. You were part of it. My relationship with you, it was cover for the mission. My adoption was arranged by military intelligence. They needed an asset who could blend into communities, who had a reason to be around families with children. A single father raising a sick daughter, it was perfect cover. You could stay in one place for months, building relationships, gathering intelligence, waiting for the right moment to strike. Luther looked up at Sarah's ashes on the mantelpiece, understanding finally that they weren't ashes at all. What's in the satchel? Sand from the desert where you buried the Santos family. I thought it was fitting that you carry their grave dirt with you, even if you didn't know it. Sarah followed his gaze to the mantelpiece. You've been visiting their bones every night, asking for forgiveness from people you murdered. It would be poetic if it weren't so pathetic. The sound of approaching horses reached them through the night air, multiple riders moving fast across the desert toward the house. Sarah smiled grimly as she heard them. Coming. Right on schedule. Colonel Morrison received word that your memory was returning. He's coming to clean up loose ends personally. She moved to the window and peered through the shutters. 4 men, all heavily armed. They planned to eliminate both of us and burn the house to destroy any remaining evidence. Luther's military training, unaffected by Dr. Wendell's memory treatments, kicked in automatically. He assessed escape routes, defensive positions, available weapons. But Sarah was already moving with practiced efficiency, pulling hidden weapons from concealed locations throughout the room. I've had 15 years to prepare for this night, Papa. Every board in this house has been modified, every room turned into a potential fortress. The Santos family's tunnel system has been expanded and improved. I've been waiting for Morrison to come finish what he started. She handed Luther a rifle and ammunition, her movements calm and professional. You have a choice to make. You can try to run, try to hide from what you've done. Let Morrison kill me and bury the truth forever. Or you can fight not as the programmed killer you were, but as the father you should have been. Luther checked the rifle's action, muscle memory guiding his hands despite the chaos in his mind. Why are you giving me a choice? Why not just kill me yourself? Because despite everything you've done, despite all the pain you've caused, you're still the man who taught me to shoot, who carried me through snowstorms when I was too sick to walk. Sarah's voice softened slightly. You're still the father I loved before I learned what you really were. And because the Sarah Pike, who died in that chamber 15 years ago, believed that even monsters could choose redemption. The horses were closer now, their riders calling out orders in military cadences that brought back fragments of Luther's suppressed memories. Sarah moved to blow out the candles, plunging the room into darkness. "They're not just coming to kill us," she said quietly. "They're coming to silence everyone who knows the truth about Operation Desert Shield. Father Morales, the families of other victims, anyone who might expose what really happened here. Tonight isn't just about our family, it's about justice for everyone your unit destroyed." Luther understood finally why he'd been drawn back to this place, why his buried memories had fought to surface despite Dr. Wendell's conditioning. The spirits he'd sensed in the house weren't supernatural manifestations, they were the psychological pressure of suppressed guilt, his mind's desperate attempt to remember and atone for his crimes. "The Santos children," Luther said suddenly. "In the cave, I saw them. They were trying to tell me something." "They were trying to tell you who killed them," Sarah replied. "You've been haunting yourself, Papa, your own conscience refusing to let you forget, even when the doctors tried to make you." Outside, the riders had reached the property. Luther could hear them surrounding the house, taking positions for an assault. In the darkness, Sarah's hand found his. "For what it's worth," she whispered, "I forgive the father you were before they turned you into a killer. But the man who murdered innocent families, who tried to kill his own daughter, that man has to answer for what he's done." Luther squeezed her hand, feeling both love and terror in equal measure. "Then let's make sure he gets the chance." The attack came with military precision, just as Luther's recovered memories told him it would. Colonel Morrison's voice carried across the desert night, cold and authoritative, as he positioned his men around the house. "Captain Pike, you're in violation of your conditioning protocols. Exit the structure with your hands visible and report for immediate reconditioning." Sarah moved like a shadow through the darkened house, checking defensive positions she'd spent years preparing. "He still thinks you're his programmed asset," she whispered. "He doesn't know your memory has fully returned." Luther's hands found the rifle's familiar weight, muscle memory taking over, despite the turmoil in his mind. Through gaps in the shutters, he could see muzzle flashes, as Morrison's men tested the house's defenses with probing shots. The bullets struck thick adobe walls reinforced with steel plates Sarah had installed during her years of preparation. "Southeast window," Sarah called softly, pointing to where one of the attackers was attempting to flank their position. "He's yours." The shot came naturally, Luther's military training overriding 15 years of psychological conditioning. The man dropped silently, his weapon clattering against the stone foundation. For a moment, Luther felt the cold satisfaction of a successful engagement, then horror crashed over him as he realized how easily the killer inside him had awakened. "Two more coming through the cellar entrance," Sarah reported, her voice calm and professional. "They don't know about the tunnel modifications." She disappeared through a doorway Luther hadn't noticed before one of many hidden passages she'd created throughout the house. The Santos family's original escape routes had been expanded into a three-dimensional maze that turned their former prison into a fortress. Gunfire erupted from below as Sarah engaged the infiltrators in the tunnel system. Luther heard the distinctive crack of her rifle, followed by the heavier boom of military-issue weapons. But there was something else, voices that seemed to echo from the walls themselves, whispers in Spanish that grew louder as the violence escalated. "Santa Maria, protégenos," the voices pleaded. "Holy Mary, protect us." Luther realized the house itself was remembering, the accumulated trauma of decades manifesting as the battle reached its crescendo. The Santos family's terror, their desperate prayers, their final moments, all of it, bleeding through the walls like psychic residue activated by fresh violence. Morrison's voice boomed through a speaking trumpet. "Pike, your daughter is a terrorist and a traitor. She's been feeding information to Mexican revolutionary groups. You have 60 seconds to produce her, or we breach and eliminate all occupants." "He's lying." Sarah's voice came through the house's modified speaking tube system. "But it doesn't matter. He's going to kill us both regardless." Luther moved to the front window, using the wooden cross above the fireplace as cover. Through the shutters, he could see Morrison himself, older now, grey-haired, but still carrying the rigid posture of a career military officer. the man who had ordered the murder of dozens of families, who had turned Luther into an unwilling killer, who had tried to murder Sarah to protect his secrets. "Colonel Morrison," Luther called out, "this is Captain Pike. I remember everything now, every family, every child, every life you ordered me to take." Morrison's response came without hesitation. "Then you know why you can't be allowed to live. You were the perfect soldier, Pike. Efficient, thorough, unquestioning. Doctor, Wendell's treatments made you even better, all the skills without the inconvenient conscience." Sarah reappeared beside Luther, her clothes torn and bloodied, but her eyes fierce with determination. "The two in the tunnels are down, but Morrison has more men positioned around the property." Luther studied the tactical situation through gaps in the fortifications. Morrison had chosen his position well far enough from the house to avoid return fire, close enough to coordinate the assault. But Luther's returning memories included knowledge of the man's habits, his preferences, his weaknesses. "He always keeps an escape route," Luther murmured. "Morrison never commits to a position without multiple exit strategies." "The horses," Sarah said, understanding immediately. "He'll have left someone with the horses, positioned to cover his retreat if things go wrong." Luther felt a cold smile cross his face, the expression of the killer Morrison had created. "Then we give him something to retreat from." Sarah handed him a device Luther recognized as a military demolition charge, modified with additional shrapnel. "I've been saving this for Morrison personally. The cellar is rigged with enough explosives to bring down half the mesa. When he comes close enough, you'll take out his escape route," Luther finished, "and I'll take out Morrison." The plan was simple, brutal, and exactly the kind of tactical thinking Morrison had trained into Luther during their years of collaboration. But now the training would be turned against its creator, the perfect soldier finally choosing his own targets. Maria Santos's wedding ring still hung from a chain around Luther's neck. He'd found it in the chamber below and worn it as a reminder of his victims. Now he kissed the simple gold band and whispered a prayer in broken Spanish. "Perdoname, Maria. Forgive me. Let me make this right." Sarah gripped his shoulder, her touch carrying both forgiveness and determination. "For all of them, Papa, for every family he destroyed through us." Outside, Morrison was moving his remaining men into position for the final assault. Inside, a programmed killer and his daughter prepared to face the man who had created them both and to ensure that Operation Desert Shield would finally die with its architect. The Devil's Porch was about to claim its last victims. The final assault began with Morrison's voice cutting through the desert night like a blade. "You were my greatest success, Pike. Don't throw away everything we accomplished together." Luther positioned himself at the fortified window, Sarah's modified rifle steady in his hands. Through the scope, he could see Morrison advancing with two remaining soldiers, their movements coordinated with the precision of men who had done this many times before. But Luther had done it more times, had been Morrison's instrument of death for years before Dr. Wendell's treatments made him forget. "He's coming for the front door," Luther whispered into the speaking tube, "just like he taught me direct assault while the target is distracted by flanking maneuvers." Sarah's voice came back through the system. "Charges are set. When he reaches the porch, I'll blow his escape route. But you have to take the shot first if Morrison realizes we're about to cut off his retreat. He'll fall back." Luther centered the crosshairs on Morrison's chest, feeling the familiar calm that had once made him the perfect killer. His finger found the trigger's sweet spot, and for a moment he was back in 1881, following orders without question, eliminating targets without conscience. But then, Maria Santos's wedding ring pressed against his chest, and Luther heard other voices joining the whispered prayers, echoing through the house. Elena's childish laughter, Miguel's nervous questions about the strange men who visited at night, Joaquin's tears when he'd found his wooden soldiers broken. All the children Luther had murdered, all the families he'd destroyed, speaking through the walls of their former home. For them, Luther breathed, and squeezed the trigger. The shot took Morrison center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. But the old colonel was tougher than his age suggested. Instead of falling, he raised his own rifle and returned fire, bullets splintering the wooden cross above Luther's head. "Now!" Luther shouted. Sarah's demolition charges erupted in sequence, starting with the area where Morrison had left his horses and spreading inward toward the house. The desert floor heaved and cracked, swallowing two of Morrison's men in clouds of dust and debris. The carefully planned escape routes collapsed into smoking craters, trapping the survivors in a killing ground of Sarah's design. But Morrison was still moving, crawling toward the house with grim determination, despite the blood spreading across his uniform. Luther could see the man's eyes through the scope, cold, calculating, already planning his next move, even as his life bled out into the desert sand. "He's not going to stop," Sarah called through the speaking tube. "Even dying, he's still coming." Luther understood. Morrison was a soldier to the end, following his mission parameters, even as his body failed. The man had spent decades turning other people into killers, and he would not accept defeat from one of his own creations. "Then I'll meet him halfway," Luther said, rising from his position. "Papa, no! The house is our advantage." But Luther was already moving, drawn by something deeper than tactical thinking. Morrison represented everything Luther had become. Under military orders, the willingness to murder innocents, the ability to sleep peacefully after destroying families, the cold efficiency that prioritized mission success over human life. Facing Morrison from safety felt like hiding from his own guilt. Luther stepped onto the porch, where the Santos family had once watched sunsets and played with their children. Morrison was 30 yards away, still crawling forward, his rifle trailing behind him in the dust. When he saw Luther emerge, the colonel managed a bloody smile. "There's my boy," Morrison wheezed. "Still can't resist the direct approach. That's what made you perfect for the work." "I remember what you made me do," Luther said, walking slowly toward his former commander. "I remember every face, every name, every child who begged for mercy before I killed them." "And you did it beautifully," Morrison replied, struggling to raise his rifle. "Clean, efficient, emotionally detached. You were everything a soldier should be." Luther stopped just out of Morrison's reach, looking down at the man who had shaped him into a killer. "The Santa's children called me Uncle Luther. Elena showed me the wooden doll her father made for her. Miguel asked if I could teach him to carve animals like his papa did." "Targets," Morrison corrected, blood frothing at his lips. "They were targets, not people. That's how you stayed sane long enough to complete the missions." "That's how you stayed sane," Luther said. "But it drove me insane, didn't it? That's why you needed Dr. Wendell's treatments, because I was breaking down, because even a perfect killer has limits." Morrison's smile faded as he realized Luther was beyond his psychological control. "You can't undo what you've done, Pike. You can't bring them back. You're a killer, and that's all you'll ever be." Luther knelt beside his dying commander, Maria Santos's wedding ring catching the moonlight as he reached for Morrison's throat. "Maybe, but I can make sure you never create another one." The colonel's eyes widened as Luther's hands closed around his windpipe, not the quick, professional kill of a military assassin, but the desperate grip of a father, finally protecting his child from the monster who had tried to destroy them both. Morrison's last words were barely audible. "You'll escape what you are." But Luther held on until the light faded from Morrison's eyes, until the man who had orchestrated Operation Desert Shield breathed his last breath in the shadow of the Devil's Porch. The desert fell silent except for the wind and Sarah's footsteps as she emerged from the house to stand beside her father over their enemy's body. Dawn broke over the Devil's Porch with a silence Luther had never experienced before. Not the hollow quiet of a man avoiding his past, but the deep peace of secrets finally brought to light. Sarah sat beside him on the porch steps, both of them staring at Morrison's body as the rising sun painted the desert gold. The colonel's blood had already been absorbed by the thirsty earth, leaving only a dark stain that would fade with the next rain. "It's over," Sarah said quietly, though neither of them moved to disturb the stillness. Luther's hands shook as he pulled a small leather journal from his vest pocket, the final artifact that would ensure the truth survived them both. Throughout the night, as they'd waited for Morrison's assault, he had written everything he could remember. Names, dates, locations, methods. Every family destroyed by Operation Desert Shield, every child murdered on military orders, every innocent life sacrificed for secrets that had died with Morrison. "I wrote it all down," he said, offering the journal to Sarah. "Everything I can remember about what I did, what we did. The families deserve to have their stories told, even if mine ends here." Sarah took the journal but didn't open it. "Father Morales is riding toward town right now, with copies of all the evidence we've gathered. By sunset, every newspaper in the territory will know about Operation Desert Shield. Families will finally have justice." "And what about you?" Luther asked. "What happens to Sarah Pike now that her father's sins are exposed?" She was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun climb above the eastern mesas. "I don't know. For 15 years, my entire life has been focused on this moment, on bringing you and Morrison to account for what you did. I never planned beyond tonight." Luther understood the feeling. His own quest for peace had led him to this place of reckoning, but he hadn't considered what came after the debts were paid. "The Santos family," he said suddenly, "they're still down there, in the desert where I buried them. They deserve a proper burial, proper grave markers with their names." "I've already made arrangements," Sarah replied. "Father Morales knows where you put them. They'll be moved to the church cemetery, with headstones that tell the truth about how they died and who killed them." Luther felt something ease in his chest, not forgiveness, exactly, but the beginning of acknowledgement that some wrongs could be addressed, even if they couldn't be undone. "And the others? All the families I destroyed? Father Morales has been documenting them for years, working with families who survived, gathering evidence. Your journal will help fill in the gaps, help people understand what really happened to their loved ones." Sarah finally opened the journal, scanning the pages of careful handwriting. "You remembered more than I expected. The memories came back all at once when Morrison died, like his death broke the last of Dr. Wendell's conditioning." Luther looked at his hands, still stained with Morrison's blood. "I remember every face now, every plea for mercy I ignored. I remember enjoying it sometimes, feeling proud when Morrison praised my efficiency." "That wasn't you," Sarah said firmly. "That was what they made you into. The father who taught me to read, who carried me through blizzards, who used to sing me to sleep, that man was real too." Luther wanted to believe her, but the weight of recovered memories made it difficult to separate the man he'd been from the killer he'd become. "How do you live with it? Knowing what I am, what I've done?" "By remembering that you chose to fight them in the end. By knowing that you came back here not as their programmed asset, but as a father trying to protect his daughter." Sarah closed the journal and tucked it into her coat. "Morrison was right about one thing: you can't undo what you've done. But you can make sure it matters that you tried." In the distance, a rider approached across the desert, Father Morales, returning from his mission to spread the truth about Operation Desert Shield. Behind him came others, territorial officials, newspaper correspondents, families of the victims who had waited decades for justice. The isolation that had protected the Devil's Porch from scrutiny was ending forever. "What will you tell them about me?" Luther asked. "The truth, that you were a victim of military experimentation, a good man turned into a weapon against his will. That when your memory returned, you chose to fight for justice instead of protecting your handlers." Sarah stood and offered him her hand. "That Captain Luther Pike died with Morrison last night, and only my father remains." Luther took her hand and rose, feeling lighter than he had in years, despite the crushing weight of his crimes. "I don't deserve forgiveness." "Probably not," Sarah agreed. "But the dead deserve to be remembered, and the living deserve to know the truth. That's worth more than what either of us deserves." Father Morales reached the house as they spoke, his face grim but satisfied. "It's done," he called out. "The territorial governor has already ordered an investigation. Morrison's superiors in Washington are scrambling to distance themselves from Operation Desert Shield. The story will be front-page news from here to the Atlantic." Sarah smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness Luther had seen from her since their reunion. "Then the Santos family can finally rest." As if summoned by her words, a warm breeze stirred the desert sage, carrying with it the sound of children's laughter and a woman's gentle singing. Luther felt the presence of the Santos family one last time, not as accusers or harbingers of guilt, but as people whose story would finally be told, whose deaths would finally have meaning. Maria Santos's wedding ring still hung around Luther's neck, but its weight no longer felt like a burden. He would wear it for the rest of his life, however long that might be, as a reminder that love and family were worth more than any military mission or government secret. The Devil's Porch had claimed its last victims in Morrison and his men. What remained was just a house where a family had once lived and loved, where their memory would be preserved by the man who had destroyed them and the daughter who had saved them both. In the end, that would have to be enough.